50 papers were handed in. But when something more important is going on, like looking at works of art, or listening to poetry, or ruminating on some music, or even allowing little pearls of wisdom to drip out of my mouth, then of course that is not creditable. I would be very grateful if auditors were to hold up their hands. Well, isn't it interesting, you see? Those are people who have absolute reality. And then the rest of you have reality, and those who can't be bothered to come are singularly deficient little ghosts, ghouls, quagmires, particles of dust, froth, the effervescence which has finally floated away from flat beer. Winchell's donuts sopped in Winchell's coffee. What's left in the box without Jack, etc., etc. The sort of people you don't beget, you don't go through any act of copulation or conception or delivery to beget, but you buy in a dime store. How further can we insult them? How much lower? I shake the dust of my mind off me and refuse to consider them any further. At the moment there should be circulating amongst you some extremely funny photographs. They are very funny, aren't they? Yes, they are absolutely marvelous. Circulate them faster, please. I can't wait all day, but circulate them faster. They're done by a young gentleman who is obviously exceedingly gifted in many, many respects. I thought this morning I would read a few startlingly sparkling papers, but I find that by the time my diatribe against absent members is over, and I've read to you, and could we have the slides down, the screen down, and the lights relatively off, so that you can listen to the poem and at the same time look at the appropriate image. Screen down, darling.
We need the slides. We need the slides.
Oh, how very sweet of you. Yes. Well, you have the greater luck, and I will in fact read the paper that goes within these absolutely wonderful photos. Pass them on at top speed. And this paper starts, "Dear Mr. President, as a young patriot with a vested interest in the continued high regard in which we, the citizens of the United States, are held by the citizens of lesser nations, we feel it's my civic duty to inform you as to my concern regarding the clear and present danger our international image currently faces. As the indisputed world power and purveyor of truth, justice, and liberty," I would like a little more light on, darling. "Un peu più, s'il vous plaît." Eccole. Fiat moderate looks. Fiat a little more looks, please. A little more. Bravo. As the indisputed world power and purveyor of truth, justice, and liberty throughout the free world, the United States, I believe, has been all too lenient with foreign aggressors and internal agitators alike. I don't know about you, Mr. President, but I'm sick of being pushed around. It is therefore necessary to take immediate action. I believe it was Plato who once said, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. Inherent in that sentiment is, I believe, the means by which our national image can rise to heights hitherto unparalleled. My proposal, Mr. President, is a simple one, which can be summed up in two words: visual connotation. As the President, your image is a reflection of our great country. To bolster it is to bolster that of our nation as a whole. I believe that in order for us to assume our proper place in world politics, it is imperative that you begin associating yourself with the time-honored symbols of authority. As a king has his crown, a pope his ring, and a general his sword, so too should you have not just one, but all of these. I propose a full-scale media blitz depicting you as such popular heroes as Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, and Joan of Arc. From the dramatic busts of Alexander to the formal portraits of Napoleon, art has proved a time-honored tactic by which empires are forged. Of all people, you, Mr. President, should realize the importance of imagery in this most ludicrous age, in which a peanut farmer, yes, even a second-rate actor, can attain the topmost round of the ladder. Should you decide to entertain my suggestion as a possible means by which to salvage your somewhat faltering image, I would like you to remember me as a candidate for the position of court artist of your most honorable administration. In effort to best illustrate my point, and in testimony as to my qualifications, I have enclosed some altered reproductions, as well as a photograph of a portrait bust that I did of my father. Needless to say, there are no longer any disciplinary problems at our house. As Rigaud did for Louis XIV and Greenough did for Washington, so too can I do for you. With affection, Michael Caine Miller. Michael Caine Miller. Where is Michael? Where is Michael Caine Miller? Where is Michael Caine Miller? You're hiding over there. Well, Michael Caine Miller, there you are. Well done. Many congratulations. And Mr. Miller will wish to collect his beautiful photographs for further display at the end of the hour. In the meantime, I trust you're all enjoying them. Is that true? That they're really very, very funny indeed, aren't they? Particularly one of our Ronnie as Napoleon. Well, anyhow, now we will have the lights down a bit because I don't need much light for this. And I'm going to read you a poem by John Keats. Seasons of mist and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the moss cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd, and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more, and still more, later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometime, whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-beat furrow, sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook bears the next sways and all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozing, hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then, in a wailful choir, the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, And now, with treble soft, the red-breast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. We often associate Wordsworth with John Constable. We can often associate Turner with Percy Bysshe Shelley, and I think we can associate Samuel Parma very often with John Keats. And what I really wanted to start this lecture off by was by pointing out to you the extraordinary wealth of variety in both the poetry of landscape and the painting of landscape in the English tradition in the 19th century. And we should possibly say one or two things more about the whole nature of the English tradition of landscape. I talked about the English landscape garden, but it runs beyond that. I mentioned to you a moment ago Sir Robert Walpole and his passionate love of hunting and country pursuits, and it was absolutely typical of the English aristocracy and indeed the whole of the English governing classes, including gentry, to spend the season in town, that is to say the time from February through till June, and then go down to their country places to spend the summer and autumn. And even if they were not very wealthy and didn't live very near London, they would do that with provincial cities. And no gentry, no governing class was more interested in agricultural reform and indeed scientific agriculture than the English governing classes. Because the English governing classes basing themselves to some extent on some Dutch precedents, who began, you see, that quite extraordinary business of blood breeding. It starts off, of course, with racehorses. And the earliest really serious racehorse breeding starts in the 17th century, actually at the time of Charles II, when an Arabian strain is introduced. By the middle of the 18th century, you're getting prize rams and prize bulls, who would be let out for 1,000 guineas a night to impregnate suitable ewes or suitable cows, so that the breeding of bloodstock begins that agricultural revolution, which then spreads through the enclosure movement. Again, it's English people who tend to mechanize agriculture fairly early with horse hoes. And by the beginning of the 19th century, that whole movement is spread very far afield, so that the English landscape is deeply worked as well as much loved. And the English upper classes have a knowledge of landscape, perhaps, have a knowledge of country pursuits, which far exceeds, for instance, that of much of the French aristocracy, or the German aristocracy, far less the aristocracy, the wild Magyars, or the turbulent Poles, or the indolent citified Italians. And I think that also helps you to understand why there develops this passion within English painting for landscape. And I'm showing you three, could we have the lights down now? I'm showing you the three major people I want to talk about. Lights down, please. The three major people I want to talk about. And I'm starting with the youngest first. And this is a painting of Magic Apple Trees by Samuel Parma. And you look and you see that Samuel Parma produces an apple tree which is so densely loaded with apples that it is, of course, absolutely falling over. And you notice that this apple tree is in a kind of valley, which itself is clogged with fertility. And Parma's vision, we shall see, is a vision as rich, as ripe, as full of swelling gourds and clustering vines and drunken bees, as is the vision of John Keats. And we can then contrast it with the extraordinary vision, next slide please, of JWM Turner, a vision which stretches from early beginnings in the topographic tradition to late watercolors, which in their brevity, their essentiality, their color experiment, and their instantaneity really outdo almost all the Impressionists, with the possible exception of certain paintings by Monet. And here is one, as you can see. The liberation of color is extraordinary, the rapidity of notation is extreme, and the simplicity of composition develops out of a primary interest in color and atmosphere and optical sensation. And what makes it so particularly fascinating in the case of Turner is that Turner achieves a degree of often optical veracity, which is nonetheless based to an extraordinary extent not upon simply looking or even necessarily always having his paints handy, but upon the best trained visual memory that the world has ever seen. I think there is no doubt that Turner has a more extraordinary capacity to remember things than anybody else. And the third figure, John Constable, almost Turner's exact contemporary, and contrasted always with Turner in the minds not only of art historians but of all lovers of landscape. A contrast which is fascinating partly because Turner is Mr. Success. Turner becomes a Royal Academician at about the age of 25. Indeed, they had to bend the laws in order to elect him. Constable becomes an associate academician at the age of 40 or something, and does not become a full academician till either 1829 or 1830. I can't remember which day now. But then, by then he is in his middle 50s. There's another fascinating contrast between the two of them, which you might as well grasp immediately. Turner, I suppose, probably taught a little bit like that. Because Turner, you see, was a Cockney. And he dropped all his H's. He hadn't got an H in his head, so to speak, whereas Constable was very much a countryman. And it is often said by elderly artists that Turner learnt his sunset effects by watching the smoky skies of the Great Wen, of Old Smoke, of London. Because, of course, it is exactly the smokiest skies that produce the most lurid sunsets because of the greater refraction of the actual quality of the sunlight. Constable, perhaps, is more closely and nearly understood in terms of French painting and the Impressionists, because in 1824, Constable won a gold medal at the Paris Salon. And young Monsieur Delacroix, having seen a Constable, returns to painting the painting that I showed you last time, I think, Scenes from the Massacres at Chios, and repaints it in very considerable detail, particularly the background, but not only the background, the foreground, because he's fascinated by Jean Constable's extraordinary technique, you see. So they are a fascinating pair. And I'm going to start you, well, this is a Constable, and as you can see, the boldness with which he handles oil paint, the dotted notation, and something else which is enormously important, a new vision of hierarchy. A new vision of hierarchy in which a tree trunk is more important than a person. All these things in Constable lead perhaps directly into the center of 19th century landscape painting, just as much in Turner leads very directly towards the center of 20th century non-figuration. And I suspect that of all the influences upon American painting in the 1950s, and in particular many Californian painters, the influence of Turner is the greatest, because of course in the early 1950s Turner had his centenary, and there were great celebrations, and so many of his paintings, which had been unhung for 100 years and more, were brought out and hung and reframed and admired and proved to be overwhelming in their colour symphonies. So that there's a good excuse, beyond my being merely English, for looking at these artists in some detail. And we're going to start by looking at Turner. And when we start looking at Turner, we're at once astonished by his precocity and rather put off by what it's actually aimed at. This is a very early Turner, done I suppose when he was 14 or so, about 1790, perhaps 14 or 15. And by that stage Turner had already started earning the family living. His father was a barber in the city of London. And Turner started earning his living and started, actually earning for the family as a very young man indeed, probably before he even got into his teens, colouring prints and colouring landscape prints and colouring aquatints, so that he really learnt by a very special method of copying. And one of the things, of course, he learnt was the tremendous value of watercolour. He also, of course, learnt the tradition. And I've talked to you about the tradition being a tradition in which topography is very important. And here we see a portrait of a medieval building which has been turned into a farm. Notice one thing which is going to be very characteristic of Turner. The brilliant way in which he depicts light falling. It is in fact rather hard, isn't it? You'll notice another thing about Turner, that he really is not very much interested in foliage. The foliage is really comparatively conventional, isn't it? And it might be made out of grocer's grass. There's another thing, Turner does not always find it very easy to move across the foreground. And the horse is a very, very odd horse. On the other hand, the architecture is already extremely efficient. And of course, doing these aquatints, colouring these aquatints, he was immediately familiar with a great deal, let's have a look at the next, with a great deal of this. It is absolutely fascinating to contrast early Turner with early Constable. And I think you can see that Turner is totally ruthless. This is a Constable, and Constable is so much less efficient. This is Constable done at the age of 20, my dear. So there's hope for you. Some hope for you. And you can see, I mean, Constable has very little grasp of perspective. He doesn't have a handy ruler. His lighting effects are ordinary. And you can see also that he's exceptionally timid in many respects. The interesting thing, however, is that we can also learn from this early Constable drawing something about his essential nature. And his nature has a tremendous sensitivity and delicacy towards textures, towards very humble things. Turner, Gothic ruins. Constable, a little cottage. And actually you can see that though he can't at this stage draw a tree very well, he simply adores the whole notion of the wind blowing in its leaves. And he loves the shaggy edge of the moss-covered thatch. And he loves a bit of rotten old brickwork. And he loves a door which is just about to collapse. And that is a sensibility which he maintains throughout his life. Well, Turner moves with astonishing speed through his early year. Here's another early Turner, which reinforces one's sense of his pretty great lack of sympathy for foliage, but his determination to master it. And again, you can see he's still having foreground problems. Next, which is very characteristic. Compare with our third character, Samuel Parma. And this was done probably when Parma was about 20. And Parma's story is entirely different from the story of Turner and Constable. Turner, precocious, but developing ever and ever onward. Constable, a slow bloomer, but coming into fruition when he marries and reaches his maturity and painting better and better to the end of his life. Samuel Parma, at the age of 20, with a style fully formed, largely speaking based upon a mixture of Dürer and William Blake, wonderfully romantic, extraordinarily rich, and almost totally incapable of any kind of development except downward. Constable's marriage is a marriage of great joy and happiness, though very short-lived. Poor Samuel Parma's marriage is a long, slow, dreary set of skirmishes. And it brings him no happy fruit. It brings him some children, one of whom dies. And it's also interesting in a way that of the three, after this brief outburst of extraordinary creativity in his early 20s, Samuel Parma becomes conventional and extremely, in many ways, old-fashioned in his technique, whereas Turner and Constable are always moving forward. And you can see, here's a Turner of, I think, the mid-1790s, of a bridge in London, and you can see already that he's now mastered water coming through the arches of the bridge. He's now mastered sky. He's mastered deep and plunging perspective. And he's also mastered, in a much greater and deeper way, the intricacies of many different kinds of architecture. He can do an old tumble-down house. He can do some Wren churches. He can do a bridge. And he can do a sky. Furthermore, he has already started on that extraordinary development of composition which makes Turner perhaps the most kinetic of all 19th century painters. His compositions are always moving. They're always pushing inwards and outwards and from front to back and from back to front. And if this is a plunge into the sharpest recession, I want you to see how it relates to work done about 50 years later, nearly I would say, which is a plunge from the painting towards you, but is based upon that same extraordinary recessional principle, but now whirling in a fascinating and totally controlled and syncopated vortex. This is the famous Rain, Steam and Speed of 1842. But you can begin to sense the later Turner in the earlier Turner. Here's another Turner, and it introduces you one other issue, which is Turner's deep interest in money. He was a poor man. He was a poor boy. His mother went mad and had to be locked up in an asylum. He was left on his own with dear old Daddy Turner, whom he deeply loved. One of those very interesting families in which son adored father. And father became, in fact, his manager. And when Daddy Turner died at the end of the 1820s, Joseph Mallard William, known usually as William, was absolutely heart-wrenched because dear old Daddy Turner was his one straightforward emotional reference. Turner never married. In the middle of the 1850s, when Ruskin went through his notebooks on behalf of the nation, to which Turner had left no less than 19,000 drawings and watercolors, it is said that Ruskin removed and destroyed a number of pornographic and unseemly drawings and paintings. There are a few nudes left in the great Turner bequest, but in general, what one has to suppose is that Turner was deeply concerned with his art, to the exclusion of many other things. And you will find in the history of art a small number of artists who have absolutely no use for intimate personal relations. They are too busy. Their love is to their art. And Turner's love was to his art and to the institution which embodied it, the Royal Academy. And I suspect that had he not been a Cockney, who had very, very poor literary education, he would have become president of the Royal Academy. As it was, when Sir Thomas Lawrence died in 1830, a man called Sir Martin Archer Shee, who was a very, very minor and poor portrait painter, took over. Now I think it was because, you see, Turner had by this stage an enormous reputation, probably still didn't have quite the right accent. So he was interested in money. And one of the best ways to make money was through book illustration. And Turner was always working with the printmakers. And this, which is a view of Christchurch, Oxford, was done for the Oxford Almanacs. And from the 1790s until the 1820s, every year Turner made an extra few guineas out of churning out that kind of illustration. Later on, he illustrated the poetry of Byron. He illustrated the poems and novels of Sir Walter Scott. And indeed, there is a whole book by Gerald Finlay about Turner as an illustrator to Scott. He produced a very, very famous book called Roger's Italy. The poetry was by Samuel Rogers, a boring poet, and the illustrations, which are stupendous, wonderful things, are by Turner. And this goes on until the end of his life, roughly, until the 1840s. He's always doing works, and he does a number of publications on his own. He does the southern ports. He does the harbours of Britain. He does his own Liber Studiorum. So we can see, starting off in a topographical mode, Turner becomes a great illustrator. And here's another view from the 1790s, probably, maybe around about 1800, a watercolour notice, largely speaking of the stage tinted, a tinted drawing, and that's, of course, the old-fashioned way of doing it, of Salisbury Cathedral. You will nonetheless notice the wonderful and fascinating composition, how you see the great steeple of the cathedral through the tracery, the broken tracery of the cloisters, and how Turner manages once again a wonderful lighting situation, and how he can deal with perspective with the very, very greatest of ease. However, it was perfectly obvious that from very early on, Turner had a romantic soul and ambitions which took him far beyond the topographer. And this is a painting, a watercolour again from about 1797, 1798. It's Uemi, which doesn't name, doesn't matter, Priory. It's the inside of a ruined church. And what is Turner now doing? He is altering his lighting methods to produce a degree of drama which is new and astonishing. The flood lights in from a little door, resting on the hens which are being fed in this broken down church, and on bits of old pew. More light streams in from upper windows. It blazes on the chancel arch and the choir scheme. And then great masses of mysterious darkness, spatially twisting, which might even remind you of Corbusier's Ronchamp. So we see Turner at about the age of 20, 21, 22, really sophisticating his work even within the world of topography. Let's have a look at the next. And this shows you a couple of pages from a sketchbook, because from very, very early on we have to envisage Turner in the summer going on a tour. And the tours are first of England, the Thames Valley, and along the coast, and then Wales, and then the north of England, and then Scotland, and then the continent, the Alps, and then after a very long pause, because of the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, Italy, the goal of landscape painters. And Turner doesn't actually make Italy till 1819. But in the meantime, he's going over the country, and you'll notice how quickly he makes his sketches and how rapidly he notes down the primary compositions and the architectural features. And he would do this, and he might do 8 or 10 or 12 of these little almost thumbnail sketches in a day, and then in the evening he would go and colour them when he got back to his inn. He kept meticulous records, of course, of his expenses. Sometimes he would prepare coloured paper and sketch on the spot on the coloured paper, and we have some colour preparation. And as he went further abroad, so of course his feeling for landscape changed, intensified, and expanded. And here he is in the north of England, one of his earliest oil paintings, and you see that Turner is one of those exponents of changes in the weather. And here's a great upland fell, and we see a brisk brook rushing down in the middle distance, a farmer in a fell with his sheep, and then sunlight just catching these trees, and then an immense and extraordinary distance, cloud bereaved, romantic, astonishing. And Alps, mountains, Scotland, the mysterious north become more and more fascinating to this period. Turner oscillates throughout his life between two poles, which are talked about in a wonderful little book by Lawrence Gowing. He calls it Turner, Imagination and Reality. And if Turner was not well educated on the one hand, on the other hand he was a deep devourer of poetry, and he attached fragments of his own poetry to many of his paintings. They were said to be taken from a manuscript called The Fallacies of Hope. Notice that title, The Fallacies of Hope. The notion that hope is fallacious. And Turner might well be thought to be a pessimist when he paints the Seventh Plague of Egypt, round about 1800. A doom painting, a painting which you can see being related to the paintings of John Martin, which I showed you last time in The Great Day of His Wrath, for instance. And indeed Turner to some extent originates that sublime genre of disaster landscapes with a biblical theme, with a mythological basis, and with a wonderful pyramid and the most stupendous, if slightly heavy and theatrical clouds. And we should watch Turner lightening his clouds. Look at the dark colour still, browns and dark greens, a colour scheme which is less fresh even than some of the worst and least fresh Claude's brown landscape. And here, moving towards the Alps, notice now, however, the increasing subtlety. The colour still remains rather monochromatic, but notice the little fire over here, and then notice the subtlety in this watercolour of the streams of light bending over this, the extreme brilliance with which the whites are done. And Turner is described in his old age as having hands like the claws of hawks, because he used the forefinger of his right hand, the nail of that, to scratch away pigment in order to reveal the white of the paper. And Turner became the most astonishing technician. And you can see that just by considering the subtlety of the wash, which indicates the shadow and the light over here, and the more brilliant light over here, and then up again here, and then the most brilliant light striking the cloud back there and resonating down amongst the rocks, and the thrown up, hurled about old tree trunks. And Turner, the more he examines sea scenery and alpine scenery, the more grand, sublime, savage and splendid nature appears to be to him. And we can explore him looking at alpine scenery throughout his life. And here's a rather later painting, and we have something approaching an avalanche. There is a famous painting by Turner of an avalanche with a poor little cottage being dragged down. But again here, notice the broken trees, notice the somewhat unhappy goats, and notice the storm-laden sky and the great depth, and the increasing tendency to compose in terms of vortex. And then we can see the whole set of issues of mountains and lakes taken down to the 1840s. Turner is now an old man. These are his last visits to Switzerland and North Italy and South Germany, and he paints great schlosses on castles, deep, deep, deep romantic lakes, and then a diaphaneity of hills and mountains, spires of stone stretching further and further upwards, all laden with mist. But you notice, one of the things you notice most of all, the change in the colour, isn't it? From tertiaries, from browns and greys and muddy plum colours, to increasingly a concern with primaries and secondaries, with blues and reds and yellows, and with the dissolution of solid forms in the kind of mist of imaginative light. And Turner is a person who gets up earlier and earlier in the morning. We know that in the late 1820s, when other people were getting up for breakfast at Petworth, they'd find Mr. Turner had been painting from dawn 3 hours previously. Turner, possibly because of his odd education, is always interested in the art of the past, and particularly the landscape art of the past. And possibly the single most influential painter on him is the French 17th century painter Claude, sometimes known as Claude Lorraine, sometimes known as Claude Gelée of Lorraine. And Claude was indeed the popular favourite of the English governing classes, an extremely graceful painter whose trees are exquisitely shampooed and usually sort of organized to stand on either side of the painting. This is a Claude of Echo and Narcissus, and Claude had rather like Turner, not a terribly good education, and had rather like Turner a good deal of difficulty in painting human figures, but like Turner was magical and wonderful at the painting of distance. And Claude is, I suppose, the first great European painter who is magnificent at dealing with that envelope of atmosphere, at really putting into detailed practice the whole notion of Leonardo's aerial perspective. So we can see a Claude, and Claude was so popular, and then we can see a Turner. And here is a Turner, and you notice the same dark foreground, the same blue distances, but the blue is more intensified. The same trees on either side. Here is a Turner which he wished, actually it's called Crossing the Brook, which he wished always to hang next to a Claude in the National Gallery. He left it to the British nation on those conditions, and it usually hangs next to a Claude. And once again, the shampoo tree, Claude loves aqueducts or viaducts, and here's the Turnerian. The Claude loves water in the foreground for some splendid reflections. Here is Turner's water. But Turner stretches out the distance yet further and further. Into the azure he leaps for mile after mile after mile. Once again, however, you notice that, like Claude, Turner at this stage is using a brown, dark foreground and blue distances. And Turner has still a long way to go before he changes totally his palette. This is another Claude, and I show it to you particularly because it is a seaport. And remember that Turner was a Londoner, the greatest seaport in the world. Claude painted many, many paintings to do with Virgil's Aeneid, so did Turner. Claude painted the story of Aeneas and Dido. Turner painted Dido building Carthage. And here is Dido herself, and here are the great topless towers of Carthage, and here in the distance is the beckoning sun, and the other surrounded by these light veils of mist, Claudian trees, Claudian architecture, again darkness in the foreground, but now a great flash of brilliant yellow rushes at you, and the sun shoots his beams towards you across the water with a kind of rich violet. Interesting to think of Turner painting Carthage, both the building of Carthage and the decline of Carthage. Because Carthage, of course, is a symbol of London. Carthage was a mercantile empire. The British Empire was a mercantile empire. So that these paintings reverberated to rich English merchants. In his younger days, Turner was patronized a great deal by the English aristocracy. By the 1830s and 1840s, he's being patronized by splendid merchants. And it is therefore not surprising that Turner becomes preoccupied with Hannibal and does this extraordinary painting of Hannibal crossing the Alps in about 1812. And here, teeny is perhaps Hannibal. And over here, if the slide wasn't so absolutely ghastly, you would see a few elephant trunks waving. But look at the sense of grandeur, of disaster. Look at the feeling of continuous movement. And in Hannibal crossing the Alps, Turner really moves his romantic imaginings a fresh phase further. Hannibal crossing the Alps is about 1812, by the way. So the end of Turner, Claude and Virgil in 1850, right at the end of his life, as a very old man, he submits 4 paintings to the Academy exhibition, which he'd upheld for years and years and years. Often he'd finished painting them when they were already hung on the walls, and young men would gather round in admiring astonishment to watch how he put the colour in. And this is Aeneas and Anchises to Aeneas and Mercury. It's another scene from the Iliad. Well, if Turner is deeply moved by classical poetry and modern poetry, including, of course, the poetry of his contemporaries, he is also deeply moved by another experience, which is the experience of the sea. And the moment, of course, he started going to Europe, and he does this around about 1800, particularly with the Peace of Amiens, he comes across one of the nastiest bits of sea you've ever experienced, the vomitorial English Channel. And whatever it is that you've eaten, you surrender it up when you cross those narrow straits. And here is a painting which is done after one of his visits, about 1803, 1804, and it is called the Calais Packet. And as you can see, here is Calais Pier and Calais Packet, and the ships are in real trouble, and people sort of stagger ashore, wiping their mouths clean, and the weather is peculiarly filthy, and you notice already this vortical thing, the slanting of the boats, the sternness of the sea. Now the sea at this stage still looks like chopped up marble very largely. And Turner is going to lighten, and the sky looks as though it's made of stone. Turner is going to learn how to lighten both of those things. Not for nothing that Turner is also preoccupied with naval heroes, and this is the Battle of Trafalgar with Nelson. And indeed, think how popular, and Turner had his eye on the main chance, how popular sea scenes would be in a society in which almost everybody had lost somebody at sea in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, or had a cousin who was an admiral or a boatswain or a cook, a ship's cook. A little later, in the later part of the first decade, notice what has happened to the water. It has become more powerful but more liquid, less conventional, more capable of spurting and flashing and spuming in 100 different directions, and Turner is deeper into a world of disaster. A dismasted ship, and they're abandoning it, some kind of frightful naufrage, which puts, of course, the wreck of the Medusa into a sort of very stage machinery point of view. Here the elements have taken over and are smacking silly little man down in the way that King Lear wanted them to do in the storm scene. The cataracts and hurricane spout, drown ungrateful man. Turner has something of that sense. Here's a detail. Notice at the same time how well he knows the rigging. How each little block and tackle is carefully done, while the human beings are so many little fragile shrimps. We must never suppose, however, that Turner is master of only one move. Turner, the great prophet of doom and disaster, the poet of the fallacies of hope, is also Turner of the quiet morning, of the gentle sunset, of the early wreathing mists, of delightful smooth crossings. And here is a chain pair at Brighton, one of his most beautiful and serene compositions. A horizontal, just gently changed, wonderful sense of floating forms. And now you notice, this is much later, this is in the 1820s, you notice that Turner has unanchored his paintings. They no longer are caught on the edges. Particularly the foreground is no longer caught on the front edge of the canvas. And the forms float almost as they might in an oriental painting, and which I think is due partly to this continuous practice in watercolor. On the one hand, calm, and on the other hand, storm. Another stormy scene by the... and then you see further scenes of naval history. This particular watercolor has a peculiarly interesting history. One of Turner's great friends was Walter Fawkes, who was a North Country magnate, and he had a house in Yorkshire which Turner used to go and stay at on the way to and from his Scottish tours. And Fawkes had a son called Hawkesworth, who was known as Hawkie. And Hawkie said one morning to Mr. Turner, "I say, Turner, could you do a painting for me, please, sir?" And Turner said, "Of course, my boy," and immediately sat down. And in the course of an hour and a half, from various sundry mysterious rubbings and washings and grubbings and scratchings, gave form to this of a 72, that's to say, a major battleship, wooden battleship, taking in stores. Done, my dears, in a drawing room in Yorkshire, but having all the verisimilitude as though Mr. Turner had been holding his breakfast down on the choppy piece of water, looking and seeing what had actually happened. That tells you something about his memory and also his inventiveness. He could make a blot into a warship. He could make another blot into sundry little skippings of sundry little fish in sundry bits of water. Turner's fascination with the sea lasts him all his life, and it's a fascination which is always divided between the historic past and the present. And here in the 1830s, one of his most gorgeous paintings, Ulysses deriding Polyphemus. And here in the background you can see Polyphemus on his mountain home with his one eye. And here Ulysses says, "Yoo-hoo, bye-bye, bye-bye, you silly one-eyed giant, we're off." And there we are, other argosies and the great setting sun. And look at the extraordinary quality of the sunset. A magnificent fairy vision. At the same time, Turner can go to Scotland and show you a little packet boat making water off Staffa near Fingal's Cave. And I played you some Mendelssohn. I want to play you the overture to Fingal's Cave, which is written about this time in very, 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 very murky weather. And in the 1840s, almost the last of Turner's great explorations of naval things are shipwrecks. And look at this astonishing statement. You're hardly there. If you lived in the 1840s, you wouldn't know that was a shipwreck. You would say, what is that extraordinary piece of tinted steam? That's what some of the critics said about Turner. What is that mysterious set of hatchings and dottings and scrappings and scrobblings? And then you'd say, a wreck of a ship. And this is probably one which was never shown, because the public weren't ready for it. But in the 1840s, just at the time when Herman Melville was writing Moby Dick, Turner was doing a series of paintings about whalers and whales and whaling ships running aground. But in the 1840s, when you might think, it's old Turner with visions of despair, he can also do little watercolors like this one on the lagoon at Venice, calm and beautiful. Well, I tried to get you some sense of the mysteriousness of Turner's practice. It is mysterious because he alternated between watercolour and oil. He alternated between looking and imagining. He alternated between scenes of daily life and scenes of doom. He tries to embrace the whole of art. And he's ludicrously, an enormously ambitious man, 5'4" high. And he must be like many other men of about that height. What I'm showing you now is something rather interesting and different. And that is that, as well as doing watercolours, from about 1805 to 1812, absolutely crucially, my dears, Turner does a series of oil paintings, comparatively small, some of them on panel, some of them on canvas, directly from nature in the little boat which he and his father own and which they take up and down the Thames. And of course, when he wasn't actually at sea, the water was close to him because he bought a little piece of land above London and built himself a little villa there, and he used to go on fishing expeditions with his daddy. And this is, of course, something which he did in the interval of pulling pike or perch or eel out of the water on the little backwater of the River Thames. And you can see here the speed with which he manipulates and the gauziness and scaliness with which he manipulates oil paint in order to catch a domestic piece of river landscape. Here's a different one, and Windsor Castle in the background, water in the foreground, and probably these paintings, with their rich, ripe greens and browns and buff colours, are the most naive and ordinary of Turner's paintings. They are paintings in which I think he never exhibited, and they're sketches. They're paintings in which he did deepen his capacity to understand natural sensation and actually to look. And it was probably in this period, in these particular paintings, that he matured his eye, ready for its great inward flights. They're very beautiful, they're very quick and direct, they have much less strain and artifice. And there are a few finished paintings, again, of this same landscape, the Thames Valley landscape. This is actually a view in my hometown, Abingdon. And it's astonishingly like. It's early morning, and I can well remember many early mornings like that. And even the colour, in spite of the rather heavy browns in the foreground, the soft, misty, grey, mauvey colours, and the presence of mist. It isn't only the smoke of London, but it is the mist of low-lying Thames Valley, slow to burn off, soft and delicate. I talked about Turner's ambition. Well, Turner's ambition ranges beyond landscape. He realized that landscape had to be upgraded. Hence he does Plagues of Egypt. Hence he does Dido building Carthage, and so on and so forth. But he's also concerned to rival directly both his contemporaries and the great historical figures of the past. And here he just goes indoors in order to do a painting which will show his young contemporary, Mr. David Wilkie, what's what. And it's a blacksmith shop, and they're disputing the price of corn. And Wilkie used to do small figures in this kind of rather tumble-down interior, and Turner says, well, if Wilkie can do a Wilkie, so can I do a Wilkie. And he'll do that with all sorts of other people. This is Rembrandt's daughter. And Rembrandt's daughter is reading a letter, very 17th century subject, which you find in Vermeer, and you find in Rembrandt. And how is Turner painting it? He's painting it in exactly the sort of chiaroscuro of Rembrandt van Rijn. Or again, another one, which I again only show in black and white. This is Christ before Pilate. And it's extremely difficult. One can find there's Christ, but where the hell Pilate is, I think he's somewhere over here. But again, it is extremely Rembrandtian, and he is simply making a rivalry, and this is done in the 1820s. So throughout his life, it isn't just that he rivalizes Claude or Poussin or Riesdale or other landscape painters. He is ready to paint every possible kind of painting. Let's have a look at the next. And here, and you can hardly see it because it's very small, is the painting of the Dogana with the Salute with Canaletto painting it. And Canaletto is a great 18th century painter of Venice. And that introduces us to the later phase of Turner's life. And I wish I could do it in much greater detail. But as I said, in 1819, he finally goes to Italy. And he goes to Rome, and he goes to Venice. And it is a period of great receptivity in his life, and also great change in his methods. And here's a little watercolor or body color of the Arch of Constantine in Rome. And he did hundreds and hundreds on the spot. Here's another much better reproduction of the ruins of the baths of Caracalla. And you can see this now would be a small painting done in body color, that is, say, opaque water paint, done on a blue piece of paper. And the blue piece of paper would help to give you the underlying unity, and then bring up these whites, which would be done in opaque Chinese whites, you see. And done really very, very fast. And probably finished off in the evening, if not done entirely in the evening, from just an outline drawing. And from then on, I'm sorry, what a dreadful slide. It's getting lumbago and chicken pox and all sorts of other things. This is the Bay of Baiae with Apollo. And this is one of the English paintings done in England as a result of his first Italian visit. And then he gets into the habit of going to France and Italy almost yearly in the late 1820s and 1830s. And as you can see, the blue becomes more brilliant here, but it's a heavily worked painting, and that's not a very good slide. Another painting in which he tries to do something about the splendor of Rome, called Modern Rome, with all the ruins of ancient Rome and St. Peter's and the Colosseum all stuck together so that somebody could afford something like it. But much more exciting, and the most, I think, exciting thing, is Turner in Venice. Because Venice really is sort of an answer to his ideal. Venice is, like Carthage, a great mercantile city. Venice is totally water environed. Venice is also a great image of ruin, of collapse, of the passing of nations, of the decay of civilization. And Turner got to Venice and then produced the most extraordinary and wonderful series of watercolors you could possibly ever see. And this is one of the greatest of them. Done extremely fast, floating images of a lovely world. And then you will notice, you see, that Venice has this effect throughout the 19th century on painter after painter after painter. On Turner, on Corot, on James Emile Whistler, on John Singer Sargent, on Edouard Manet, on Claude Monet, right through into the 20th century, down to such a practitioner as Oskar Kokoschka. But I don't think any of these others get quite the same delicate exquisiteness out of it. Here's another watercolor. You can see now the practice of his watercolor and what it does to lighten the whole of his painting. And Venice, perhaps in particular, is the key to excitement. Here's a night scene done upon brown paper, as you see, in body color, fireworks of Salute. And here's another bolder, broader one done on a gusty day, and you can identify the Dogana, and you can identify the Doge's Palace and the Campanile and so on and so forth. And you can see an unfinished watercolor and the markings in the drawing, and then the gondolas sparting about. And from these sketches, Turner then had unbraided great oil paintings. Here's an unfinished oil painting which remained in his studio, was left to the nation. And you can see the Campanile, and you can see in the distance the Orologgia, and you can see great masses of boats festooning the Riva dei Schiavoni, and you can see the beginnings of darkness here where the Ducal Palace is going to be popped in, and then these lustrous and astonishing and iridescent and deep blues and golds. And then you see here is a completed Venetian painting just on the Laguna with San Michele in Isola over here, and great sort of testamentary clouds, because San Michele in Isola is the great burial ground of Venice, you see. And these really are elegiac. And it's an elegiac scene of brilliant blues and reds and dashing saffrons and chromes and gamboges. And Turner, of course, explores the realm of yellow, a realm which had not been explored really with any great interest since gold leaf ceased to be a major factor in medieval and Renaissance painting. And Turner's exploration of yellow looks on, of course, to Van Gogh's exploration of yellow. And his use of primaries in this area against white, of course, will remind some of you of the work of James Ensor, who was deeply influenced by Turner in his landscape. And this is going to the sea, and then you see Turner's imagination can do with Venice anything it likes. And so here we have a famous painting which you'll all be interested in because it sold for so much money not so very long ago, Juliet and her nurse in Venice. And those of you who are scholars will say, well, Juliet and her nurse in Venice? Of course that Turner was a very ignorant chap. It should be, what? Verona. Yes, he's got his V's mixed up. But why shouldn't Juliet go for a little shopping spree in Venice. You go to Bakersfield for a little shopping spree from time to time. And here is Juliet and her nurse, and here is the great scene of Venice. It's a particularly bad slide, I may say. But so you see that Venice isn't just a visual scene. Venice is a great historical and poetic monument to Turner. And Turner is nothing if he's not a poetic painter. And yet his capacity to catch visual sensation remains astonishing. His truth to nature and his truth to the inner eye of poetry is in such wonderful balance. Well, with that intense sharpness for poetry and also for the historical occasion, Turner, on one night in 1834, is woken up by a most extraordinary sight. It is the old Houses of Parliament burning. And there was a tremendous conflagration started by trying to burn, you know, in the old days they used to make accounts on what were called tallies, and you would cut a notch every time you spent a shilling. You cut a notch in the wooden tallies. Well, that was how the British Constitution had been. It had been notching in tallies. It was somewhat antique. Those of you who read Dickens are familiar to it from the English law courts, which were somewhat antique. And in 1832 there had been the Great Reform Act. In 1834 they began to clear up the administration. No doubt one of these days they'll do that in the Pentagon. And they started burning some of these old tallies. And the tallies burnt wonderfully well. And the old boilers got hotter and hotter and hotter until finally things got out of control. And the old Houses of Parliament are congeries of extremely inconvenient and variegated buildings, burnt in this super conflagration. And there are about 8 to 10, I think, Turner watercolours which are clearly done either on the spot or under the red-hot inspiration. This is a more developed one, as you can see, and he didn't do all of that on the spot. But for Turner this was an extraordinary confluence of everything. See, it had this great historic meaning. The old England was burning down, the unreformed England was burning down, and a new kind of England was coming into being. So that his two great paintings of 1835 are not landscapes in a strict sense, nor are they just simply pictures of disaster. They are complex symphonies to the constitutional and political history of England. And when we look at them, and both of them, fascinatingly enough, are in American museums, we can see how brilliantly he manipulates an extraordinary variety of issues. Because this is a new bridge of Westminster. And the new bridge, of course, talks about the new world of modern engineering and modern architecture. Then notice the vast quantities of crowds which give you the sense of this vast and important metropolis, seething with human beings. And then the great conflagration, like an explosion, with a bit of old St. Stephen's Hall in the foreground. And what is this building back here? Westminster Abbey, please. Westminster Abbey, you see, and the ghost of the old Christian religion, which does not actually get burnt down, but is seen ghostly against this great pivotal turning point, you might say, in English history. And here's a detail, and then you begin to see what an extraordinary technician. Sam Francis has nothing. Honestly, William de Koning has really nothing on Turner in terms of absolute freedom and boldness in the manipulation of paint. And yet always, of course, he's describing as well as finding some kind of analog. The stuff remains paint, you know, and yet it becomes little lights. And remember that gaslight had already appeared in London round about the turn of the century. So the whole of London, up to Hampstead Heath in the background, where probably a constable looked down upon this fire, and then you can see spouting water and a great congregation of people around. Absolutely marvellous and extraordinary thing. And perhaps even more exciting, I think this one is at Cleveland, and this is another view in which the wildness of the colour and the dependence upon golds and the dependence upon palette knife. This whole area is absolutely slashed about with palette knife, again, a little tugboat dashing forward, glimmerings all over the place, marvelous color in the river, and then you see the natural light of the moonlight totally outflamed by this splendid conflagration. And once more, when you look at the actual facture, it could remind you of late Monet, but not late Monet with its calm abruptness, but late Monet somehow intoxicated, a drunken Monet, an exhilarated Monet, a Monet absolutely untrammeled. The sheer excitement of Turner's paint outrivals, the sheer excitement of Jackson Pollock's paint, I would say, because there's something slightly mechanical and forced about Turner, but there's something 10 times as mechanical and forced about Jackson Pollock. There is something theatrical about Turner. Look at this, and you see how richly he deals with the detail. Obviously an enormous group of sightseers came to see this wonderful thing. I'm sorry this is such a bad slide. In the 1830s then, we've established that Turner becomes a great interpreter of history. And he does so in this famous painting of 1837-1838 called the Fighting Temeraire. And the Fighting Temeraire was this ghostly ship, the last of the old English wooden battleships. And it was being towed to its destruction, to the knacker's yard. It was going to be broken up. It's towed by one of those new little tugboats. And they're ghost ships, ghost sailing ships behind, and the sun is going down, and here is smoky London, and it's the passing again of an old order and its supersession by a new. And Turner, as he gets older, I think becomes increasingly preoccupied by this natural sense of a change in the order of things. And perhaps it's a great inspiration to him to realize that he modulates and maximizes his own direction forward, so that while painting goes on its way, he is streets ahead. He belongs to the new order which even the Impressionists don't fully understand, the new order of the 20th century, if you like. I've talked about Turner and poetry, and I've talked about Turner and his deep, deep, deep ambition and his passionate love of his craft, of his profession. He was professor of perspective, and for many years he gave annual lectures on perspective with the most elaborate illustrations. And here we have a painting which speaks to his more intimate affections. It is called Peace, Burial at Sea. And it depicts the ship in which his colleague David Wilkie, now Sir David Wilkie, his rival in the blacksmith shop, was buried at sea after Wilkie had grown very ill during a sojourn in Spain. The black of the funeral ship has a special meaning. It isn't just an act of mourning. Turner wanted to show his colleagues in the Royal Academy and painters everywhere how you could make a painting in which you use black and white at their most startling and yet keep it in tone. This is a very violent black, and yet it stays exactly where he wants it on the picture. That is to say, well in the distance. And he places against that absence of color, brilliance of color, and yet that brilliance of color doesn't jump tonally, it doesn't jump in hue. And so he presents a tribute to his old friend and a lesson in the technique of painting, an extraordinary seascape, all in one. You notice that at this time he's particularly interested in centralized composition. And in the late 1830s and 1840s, he does a whole series of octagonal paintings. And you can see that the Tate Gallery has taken part of the frame off. But I think originally they were meant to be either octagonal or circular, some of these. And then in 1842, he really sums up the technology of the 19th century, rain, steam, and speed. And if you were to read Ruskin's autobiography, Phyteria, you would read, or just read a part of it, you would read of this astonishing scene of an elderly lady coming with a young woman coming up to London, with an old man sitting in the new railway, the Great Western Railway, which Queen Victoria just agreed to take. And the weather is rather dirty. It's a squally spring day. And suddenly, somewhere near Reading, the weather gets really awful. And this bright-eyed old man suddenly flings up the window and puts his head out of the railway carriage. And he holds it there for 15 to 20 minutes. And somewhere about Maidenhead, he pulls his head back in and says, "I've got it." And the two ladies wonder. A year later, they are, like many other fashionable ladies, going round the Royal Academy. And they look in particular at the works of Mr. Turner. And then they see Rain, Steam and Speed. And then they realize that that was Mr. Turner in their railway carriage. And that this is Maidenhead, this is the old bridge of Maidenhead, the bridge which took the coaches from London to Oxford via Reading. And this is a new railway bridge, totally outshining the old one. And this is the bridge they've come along, and this is the very little squall which they saw, and which that bright-eyed ancient mariner, Mr. Turner, had captured forever. And down here, you see people calmly fishing, oblivious, in the same way as the ploughman is oblivious of the fall of Icarus in Bruegel's great painting of the fall of Icarus. And here, you should be able to see, if it were a better slide and you had better eyesight, a little hare. And of course, this great mechanical monster outruns the fastest of old nature's beings, the hare. So Turner is never just simply depicting a mere scene. He's extorting from it everything he can in the way of historical and poetic significance. And this remains, I think, here's a better slide of it, remains perhaps his greatest masterpiece. But it's so difficult to pick among slate Turners. You simply have to go to the Tate Gallery and look. And maybe we should stop on this one, because I gather it's time for you to go. This is, no, you don't go until I've said my teeny little say. And this is Norham Castle. This is the 12th version of Norham. Could you put the lights down just one moment, because you can't see this properly. This is the most light-flooded painting. Right down, get the lights right down, lower, right, because this is the most light-flooded painting of the 19th, 20th, or any other century. And Turner becomes, in his old age, an exponent of Goethe's great dying. When Goethe lay dying, he simply said, "More light, more light." And Turner, who read Goethe's great book on colour, provided more light. And here is the most perfect azure, and here is the most perfect yellow, and here's a little touch of brilliant red. And Turner, long before the 20th century, has learned how to manipulate landscape out of primary colours to create a vision which is at once totally incredible and fairy, and exactly what you see when you get up early and dream with your first fresh breath of the morning. Thank you.